I was staying with some friends at a cabin in the woods, the kind of place where the trees loomed overhead and the only sound was the rustle of leaves. It was mid-October, and the forest floor was carpeted in a riot of color, the fading light of day casting long, playful shadows. We spent the evening huddled around the fire, laughing and joking, the warmth and camaraderie pushing any thought of unease far from our minds. It was just a normal night, the kind we had spent 100 times before. We were all exhausted, but exhilarated from a day spent exploring the wilderness. As the last rays of sunlight faded and the darkness closed in around us, we one by one began to drift off to sleep, lulled by the crackle of the fire and the stillness of the night. I was the last to fall asleep, my senses finally shutting down from sheer exhaustion. But my rest was short-lived. I was vaguely aware of being shaken awake, but it was the sound of my friend's voice that snapped me back to full alertness. "I can hear someone walking around outside," he whispered urgently, his eyes wide with fear. My heart jolted into a frantic rhythm as I sat up, my skin prickling with gooseflesh. There were no neighbors for miles around, nothing but unbroken wilderness. My mind leapt to the worst-case scenarios as I threw off the covers, my senses straining to pick up any sound. And then I heard it. Crunch of footsteps in the fallen leaves, deliberate and slow. I crept to the window, peering out into the inky blackness. At first, I saw nothing, just the usual sway of trees in the wind, the flickering dance of shadows. But then, a darkness shifted within the darkness. It was impossibly tall, a living shadow that moved with a strange, unnatural gait. My blood ran cold as I watched it glide out of sight, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. But I was not alone. There were more of them, their shadowy forms flitting at the edge of my vision. They moved in tandem, their presence seeming to fill the very air around us, a chill that sank into our bones. I spun around, my voice barely a whisper. "There's something out there." The others stared at me, confusion giving way to fear as they took in my expression. I just gestured to the window, my hand shaking. "Look for yourself." They exchanged nervous glances, but got up, crept to the window. And then they saw it too. Shadows, impossibly tall, moving through the trees with that strange, gliding gait. Their presence seemed to fill the very air around us, a chill that sank into our bones. We huddled together, barely breathing, as we listened to the sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. They were light, almost stealthy, but there was no mistaking the deliberate tread. Whatever was out there, it was circling the cabin, waiting for something. The minutes ticked by at a glacial pace, each one stretching out into an eternity. The footsteps continued their slow circuit, never quite getting closer, but never going away either. It was as if, whatever it was waiting. But for what? As the hours dragged on, our initial fear began to give way to exhaustion. We were all still shaken, but the relentless monotony of the footsteps was starting to hypnotize us. One of my friends dozed off, his head nodding forward, and I found my own eyelids growing heavy. But just as sleep was starting to claim me, the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was even more terrifying than the noise had been. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained my ears to listen. The others were staring at me, wide-eyed. We were all thinking the same thing. What was it doing now? And then, a faint scratching started up at the window. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like fingernails being dragged down the wood. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the blackness beyond the pane, my imagination running wild. Suddenly, a face appeared out of the darkness. It was deathly pale, with sunken eyes that stared into my soul. I tried to scream, but my voice was frozen in my throat. The face just kept staring, its gaze filled with a malevolent hunger. And then it vanished. The scratching stopped, and there was silence. We sat there, frozen in shock as the seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an hour. But there was no further sign of the figure, no more footsteps or scratching. It was as if it had never been there at all. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew that I would never forget the terror of that night in the cabin when the darkness itself came alive to stalk us.